The chandelier crystals were still trembling from the screen when Margaret Whitfield's fingers closed around the collar of Grace Kowalski's uniform and ripped it open in front of 200 wedding guests. Fabric tore like paper. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Champagne glasses froze halfway to open mouths. And there, exposed beneath the torn pink cotton, was a scar shaped like a lightning bolt running from Grace's shoulder blade to the middle of her back, a scar that made Margaret's own mother drop her champagne glass and whisper a name nobody in that room was supposed to remember. For one long, suspended second, the entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing, waiting to see what would happen next. If you believe people deserve second chances, and you believe kindness can survive even the cruelest rooms, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs a reminder that grace exists in this world, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Grace Kowalski had been working as a housemaid at the Whitfield estate in Charleston, South Carolina, for 3 years. She was 26 years old, quiet in the way that people become when life has taught them silence is safer than speaking, and she moved through the marble hallways of that mansion like a ghost who had learned exactly which floorboards creaked. She woke before dawn every morning, long before the family stirred, and stood in a small bathroom mirror above the garage apartment, tying her hair back with the same practiced motion she had used for 6 years, careful never to let the collar of her uniform slip and reveal what lay beneath it. She scrubbed floors that cost more than her father's old truck. She pressed shirts for a family that never once asked her last name correctly, calling her simply, the girl, or you there, when they wanted their coffee refreshed. And every night, in that same small room, she pulled out a single photograph of a little girl on a hospital bed, kissed it gently, and cried herself to sleep, praying the same prayer she had prayed for 6 years, that tomorrow would bring good news from the doctors, or at the very least, that it would not bring bad news. Nobody at the estate knew that Grace had once been someone else entirely. Nobody knew that 6 years earlier, she had been Grace Whitfield Sinclair, the beloved only daughter of a modest but proud family in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, engaged to a young man named Nathaniel Cross, the son of a wealthy real estate developer who had fallen for her not because of her family's money, which was ordinary, but because of the way she laughed with her whole body, and the way she read bedtime stories aloud to the children at the hospital where she volunteered on weekends. Their wedding had been planned for a spring morning in a small chapel her grandmother had been married in. She remembered picking out flowers with Nathaniel 3 days before the accident, remembered him teasing her about her inability to decide between peonies and ranunculus, remembered him laughing that same laugh that, 6 years later, a stranger's voice at a wedding would summon back into her chest like a ghost. The accident happened on Route 9, on a rainy Tuesday evening in March, when a delivery truck lost control and crossed the median. Nathaniel died before the ambulance arrived. Grace survived, but the fire that swept through the wreckage before rescue workers could pull her free left third-degree burns across her back and shoulder, scars that would mark her for the rest of her life, both visibly and invisibly. She spent nearly a year in and out of hospitals, undergoing skin grafts and physical therapy, relearning how to lift her arm above her shoulder, relearning how to sleep without the phantom sensation of heat licking up her spine. And through all of it, the Cross family, ashamed of a daughter-in-law who was no longer presentable for the social circles they moved in, and quietly relieved that the engagement had never been legally binding, distanced themselves further with each passing month, eventually paying off doctors and hospital administrators to keep her name out of records and headlines that might otherwise have connected their family name to a scandal they preferred forgotten. What made it unbearable, what made Grace finally change her name and disappear into the anonymity of service work, was discovering 4 months after the accident that she was pregnant with Nathaniel's child. She gave birth alone in a hospital 2 states away from anyone who knew her former name, to a daughter she named Charlotte, a daughter born with a heart condition that required specialists and surgeries Grace could never have afforded on a modest income alone. She took the housemaid position at the Whitfield estate not because she dreamed of scrubbing another family's floors, but because the pay, combined with careful saving and the rare kindness of a pediatric cardiologist who reduced her fees, was the only path she could find toward keeping her daughter alive. She told herself every single day that dignity wasn't about what people saw when they looked at her. It was about what she did when nobody was looking. She folded towels with the same care she once folded her wedding dress. She hummed hymns while she polished silver that would never be hers. She wrote Charlotte letters every Sunday night, letters she kept in a shoebox under her bed, letters that said things like, "Someday, sweetheart, we will have a home with a yard, and I will teach you to plant tomatoes the way my mother taught me." She believed, in the quiet, stubborn way of people who have already survived the worst thing that could happen to them, that somehow, someday, her daughter would have a normal life, even if she herself never did again. Then came the wedding of Margaret Whitfield to a hotel magnate named Richard Ashford, a lavish affair with white orchids flown in from 3 continents, a 12-piece orchestra, and a guest list that included 2 sitting senators and half the city's business elite. Grace had been assigned to serve champagne near the head table, an assignment she had quietly dreaded all week because formal events meant more eyes, more scrutiny, more risk of the scarf around her collar slipping. She moved carefully through the crowd, tray balanced, eyes low, until Richard Ashford turned to greet a guest and laughed at something they said. It was an ordinary laugh, low and warm, but it landed in Grace's chest like a struck bell, because it sounded, for one disorienting half-second, uncannily like Nathaniel's. She froze mid-step, tray trembling slightly in her hands, staring not at Richard but through him, 6 years and 2 states away, back to a spring morning and a chapel full of peonies that never bloomed. Margaret, already raw with wedding day nerves and 1 too many glasses of champagne, caught that frozen stare and read into it every insecurity she had been carrying since Richard's assistant had mentioned, weeks earlier, that he'd once dated someone in service. Humiliated in front of her new husband's family, convinced that some secret history existed between Richard and the housemaid, Margaret crossed the ballroom floor in 3 furious strides, grabbed the collar of Grace's uniform, and tore it open, screaming that she wanted everyone to see exactly what kind of woman had been hiding in her house. That was the moment the room went silent. That was the moment the scar was revealed, jagged and pale against Grace's skin under the ballroom lights. And that was the moment an elderly woman near the back of the room, Eleanor Cross, Nathaniel's grandmother, who had never stopped searching for the daughter-in-law her own family had erased, who had spent 6 years hiring investigators and driving to hospitals up and down the East Coast on nothing but hope, rose from her chair with a trembling hand pressed to her mouth, walked across that entire ballroom in front of 200 stunned guests, and spoke the name Grace had not heard spoken aloud in 6 years. What followed was not the fairy tale rescue people sometimes imagine, wrapped up neatly before the credits roll. There was no instant fortune, no magic reversal of 6 hard years compressed into a single evening. Eleanor Cross had spent nearly a decade estranged from her own son over how the family had treated Grace after the accident, and she wept openly as she held Grace's scarred shoulders in that ballroom, apologizing again and again for every year she hadn't looked hard enough, for every year pride and family reputation had mattered more than a grieving young woman and, as it turned out, a grandchild she never knew existed. Richard Ashford, horrified at what his bride had done in front of his family and colleagues, quietly arranged for Grace's torn uniform to be replaced with a dress from the bridal party's own collection so she would not have to walk out of that ballroom in shame, and he later admitted, in a quiet interview months afterward, that watching that scene unfold was the moment he understood he could not build a marriage with someone capable of that kind of cruelty. Margaret herself did not become a cartoon villain overnight and remain one forever, because real people rarely do. Humiliated by her own actions once the shock wore off and the story began circulating through Charleston's social circles, she found herself, weeks later, standing outside the small apartment Eleanor had helped Grace move into, alone, without cameras or an entourage, holding a bouquet of ranunculus she didn't fully understand the significance of, apologizing in a voice that cracked with something that sounded almost like the beginning of real change. Grace, who had spent 6 years learning that grace as a name and grace as a virtue were sometimes the only inheritance she had left, invited her in for coffee. But the real transformation, the one this story was always about, belonged to Grace herself. With Eleanor's support, and eventually, A reconciled relationship with Nathaniel's father, who drove 12 hours from Ohio the week after the wedding to meet his granddaughter for the first time. Grace was finally able to move Charlotte to a specialist in Boston who told her, for the first time in 6 years of appointments, and waiting rooms and sleepless nights, that her daughter's heart condition was fully treatable with a single, well-timed surgery. Grace stood in that hospital hallway holding Eleanor's hand and allowed herself, for the first time since the accident on Route 9, to cry tears that weren't made of grief but of something closer to relief, the kind of relief that arrives so suddenly after years of bracing for bad news that the body doesn't quite know how to hold it. Charlotte's surgery took place on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 months after that wedding, and it was successful. Grace held her daughter's small hand in the recovery room and told her, for the first time out loud instead of in a Sunday night letter, the whole story of her father, of the peonies and the ranunculus, of the man whose laugh Charlotte would never hear but whose kindness, Grace promised, lived on in her daughter's own bright, curious eyes. Eleanor visited every week after that, bringing tomato seedlings for the small garden Grace finally planted in the yard of the modest house Nathaniel's father insisted on helping her buy, not out of guilt alone, but out of a genuine, hard-won desire to know the family he had lost the chance to know sooner. Grace did not become wealthy overnight, and in the end, she did not need to. What she gained back was simpler and larger than money: her name, restored and spoken with love rather than shame; her daughter's future, no longer measured in fragile hope but in ordinary, beautiful things like soccer practice and lost teeth and birthday parties; and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that the scar she had hidden for 6 years was never something to be ashamed of. It was proof of everything she had survived to make it to that ballroom, to that torn uniform, to that single suspended moment, when the truth finally stood in the light for everyone to see. If this story touched your heart even a little, if it reminded you that the people we overlook in our daily lives are often carrying the heaviest and bravest stories, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Before you go, I want you to comment one single word below that describes how this story made you feel. I read every single one, and I promise you, they matter more than you know. Grace Kowalski walked into that ballroom as nobody, a woman with no name that anyone respected and no story anyone cared to ask about. She walked out as herself again. And somewhere in that small house outside Charleston tonight, a little girl named Charlotte is sleeping soundly, her heart finally strong, her mother sitting quietly on the porch under the same stars that once watched over a chapel full of peonies, because Grace never once stopped believing that dignity is the one thing no torn uniform, and no amount of cruelty, can ever take away.